Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. I'm very excited about my guest today, who is communicating with me from South Africa on this recording platform. Dr. John Hunter is a South African researcher and lecturer based in Johannesburg. And John, I wanted to tell our listeners that I first became aware of your important work at a cult conference, the International Cultic Studies Association conference, that was in Louisville, Kentucky this year. And my friend Yuval Daor, who has a very fascinating model on awe and emotion that connects the dots with undue influence, he said, you got to check out John Hunter's presentation, which I avidly attended. And I'm going to continue a little bit more flattery if you don't mind.
Not at all. Take your time.
Yeah, absolutely. So your interest in large group awareness trainings, what we in the biz call LGATs, and their impact on mood and psychosis is grounded in your personal experience of bipolar disorder and your participation in an LGAT in 2010. I should also say that in 2017, you completed your PhD in psychology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, proposing a neurobiological explanation for the relationship between LGAT conditions and results. More specifically, Dr. Hunter, you put forward a Dopaminergic-Defense Hypothesis, which offers fascinating insights into both the transformational experiences associated with large group awareness training participation, LGATs, and two, the common claims of psychological harm and problematic behavior associated with large group awareness training participation. And in 2022, you published an article summarizing the mechanism behind the dopaminergic defense in the Journal for the Cognitive Science of Religion, Hunter, 2022. And welcome to the Influence Continuum.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be chatting.
Yeah, and for me, I've worked with people from that evolved to Landmark Forum, LifeSpring, Insight. So many of these go to a hotel and have these incredible transformational experiences and then recruit everybody in the world and installation of beliefs like you are God and you create your own reality. This is my input. Or that there's no such thing as a victim, and if you got raped, it's because you created the experience, or all kinds of other bizarro things where intelligent, educated people, maybe they're at a point in their life where they're looking for some change, or maybe they're trying to get out of a bad relationship, but they wind up having these amazing experiences, and some people have psychotic breaks and nervous breakdowns, and it just causes a tremendous amount of damage. So if you're listening to this podcast and you heard me speak about undue influence in a lot of different contexts, large group awareness trainings is another one of these contexts that I warn people about. And with that, I'd like you to start by telling us your experience at a large group awareness training and how you came to evolve this incredibly important connection with brain activity and this experience.
Sure. And I think maybe the first thing to do is just to thank Yuval. He seems to have been a person who came upon my research without me knowing about it. And when I arrived at the conference, I was very unaware that there was this person who was, quite well connected and obviously had been involved in that community for quite a while. And it was really just amazing to kind of see also that his work kind of it's very similar to mine in a lot of ways. And it's really nice when you kind of you've done work and you're not too sure, it feels right, but nobody's recognizing it. And somebody clearly competent and, a very smart person has kind of come to very similar conclusions on his own. So that was a really nice thing for me. I think a lot of
I'll just add, forgive me, John, I'll just add that I've interviewed Yuval, so people can come to freedomofmind.com, look up Yuval, Yuval, or Laor, or look him up on academia or ResearchGate or any number of other sites. But back to you. He was the one who introduced me to you.
So it was great to actually have other people have a look at my research, because to me it makes a huge amount of sense, and I struggled to kind of get people to have a look at it, and so it's great that people are looking at it at the moment. In terms of the way that I became involved in a large group awareness training, I think it is useful to kind of go back a little bit to my diagnosis of bipolar disorder, because it really was crucial in me coming up with the hypothesis or the theory that I have got at the moment. So I was diagnosed in 2003, and for those that don't know much about bipolar disorder, it can be a really destructive illness. I mean, 50 to 60% of people often are not able to work properly. It can cause problems in relationships with your family, very high suicide rates. And so I really wanted to understand it and manage it as well as I could. So from 2003 to 2010, I was studying the illness and trying to understand what causes further episodes.
And let's describe for our listeners who may not be familiar with that, what bipolar disorder is, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I think a lot of people are more familiar with depression. So depression is kind of the low end of the mood spectrum, and generally it involves low levels of energy, feeling really pessimistic, feeling very guilty and ashamed and negative, and just feeling like your life has no value. And obviously the association with suicide and depression is close, because people just believe that life will never get better. And often, if you look objectively at that person's life, it's actually not nearly as bad as they think it is. I mean, that's really the nature of depression, that you've got this lens that you're seeing the world through and yourself through and the future through that's incredibly negative.
Right.
Bipolar disorder is really just, it's a mood disorder that involves, so depression is often called unipolar depression, because it just involves the lower side. Bipolar disorder involves that lower side, but it also involves really elevated states called hypomania and mania. Hypomania actually means below mania, so it's not as extreme, and mania is kind of the most extreme elevated states. And what you see in people that are hypomanic or manic is extreme levels of confidence, sometimes becoming grandiose. You see euphoria, you see often impulsivity, because people just sense that their behavior is going to have positive consequences, so they take chances that they wouldn't otherwise take, or they make decisions very quickly without really thinking about it. You see very high levels of energy. So I'm going to describe in my own case my first manic episode. So hypomania is not as extreme as this, but my first manic episode, I was awake for 9 days in a row, and no need for sleep, incredibly high level of energy, very productive, often comes with a great sense of creativity. So there's a lot of literature about the relationship between creativity and hypomania and mania. And it's an incredibly empowering, beautiful space to be in before it kind of gets really out of control, and then it can get quite scary. So there's really that sweet spot that feels absolutely fantastic. So I understood very well what the symptoms of bipolar disorder were, because I'd spent a lot of time reading up about it and trying to understand it. But I also understood the triggers very well. And so the triggers of hypomania and mania, which are these elevated states, in the literature, what you see is psychological stress is a major trigger. Sleep disruption is another major trigger. And sleep disruption is actually a form of psychological stress, or it's a form of stress. So it does the same thing to your body in terms of cortisol and some of the other hormones that are floating around. And And then the other major trigger was goal attainment. So achieving some sort of goal. And another way of interpreting goal attainment is some sort of reward. You achieve some sort of reward, or even another way of thinking about that is stress is abruptly removed. So when you achieve a goal, often it's because you've been striving towards it, and then suddenly you get there, and suddenly you don't have that that stress or that need to fight to get to that goal anymore. So those are three of the kind of main environmental triggers for these elevated states. There are some others, things like the use of stimulants, so amphetamines, cocaine, that kind of thing. But as we'll speak about in terms of an LGAT environment, it would be pretty conspicuous if they were handing out cocaine to people. So that's not really a possibility. The other one is seasonality. So if you live in climates where in the US, it's more the case. In South Africa, winter and summer are more or less the same thing most of the time. So you don't really have that impact of seasons. But again, that's not something you can really manipulate in a seminar. Whereas things like stress and sleep disruption and goal attainment, you can. So I understood these things very well. When I initially studied business, so I got a finance degree, and I'd been working in finance and in the corporate world for quite a while. And in 2010, I joined a company, and as happens with a lot of people that take part in LGATs, I was asked to take part in a personal development seminar as part of my induction. And if you read Margaret Singer's book, the section that's Cults in Our Midst, if you read chapter 8, it's called Intruding into the Workplace. When they speak about LGATs, it's because very often they are pushed on employees by various employers. You've got a manager who's obsessed with them and is kind of a fanatic, and then gets everyone to participate.
Yeah, they recruit human resource people, and then they order everyone in the company to go to the training. And some of these groups spend millions of dollars annually putting their people through these things.
Yeah, and there's no good evidence that they produce any lasting change, despite
not a good return on investment.
No, but they do make people feel amazing for a couple of days, or for some it's a couple of weeks. Yep. But anyway, so I go to this seminar with the best of intentions. I've never heard of these things before, so we actually tried to find out about what it was going to involve beforehand. And as you know, one of the first rule of large group awareness trainings is you don't talk about large group awareness trainings. So they will often say to people beforehand, and they'll say to graduates who are recruiting other people, don't tell anyone about what actually happens. It will ruin the experience for them. And it's very important that people don't know what's going to happen, because if you do know, then it's going to be less stressful, or you're just not going to take part. So that uncertainty.
But can I just add in? For me, the BITE model is what I use: behavior, information, thought, and emotional control, and not telling people information about who they are, what to expect, and what's going to happen to you is a sign of undue influence immediately. Yes. But they frame it as, we don't want to spoil it for you.
Yes, I mean, I would argue that there can't be informed consent. And I mean, if you read through the documents that a lot of the bigger organizations have, they describe things at a very superficial level, but they don't describe the nature of the interactions and the tone of the interactions, which is really the core of what's actually going on. It's not so much that, we're going to speak about X for, a couple of hours. It's how they speak about X. So anyway, we worked a full day on a Thursday, and then we went to this thing, and it started at 6:00. And, it started at, somebody came to the front and said, it's 3 minutes past 6, your training starts now. So it's very, very ordered. They took away our watches and our phones, and the windows were closed off, so you don't really have a sense of the passing of time. And we were there Thursday from 6:00 until 2 a.m. They gave us homework, which is very common. The next day we worked a full day, so that was Friday. Got there and started again at 6 till 2 a.m. Was given homework again. Saturday started at 9, whole day until 12 that night. They gave us homework again. And So those first 3 days were immensely stressful. I was sitting there and I was just thinking, as someone who's trying to avoid relapsing to have another manic or hypomanic episode, this is the worst possible environment that I could be in. People were screamed at. There were a lot of exercises where people were asked to share, things that had happened to them. And then, as you say, the trainer will effectively convince the person that they are responsible for whatever they've been through. You could have been gang raped, or you could have been, your parents could have beaten you and left you, and somehow they'll make you feel like you are responsible for it. And, they will obviously frame it as, we want people to be accountable. That's their way of justifying what they're doing. But if you look at the way that they interact, and if you look at my PhD, there's just example after example after example. These are people that are claiming to be experts in communication. It's not by chance that the way that they're communicating is bringing about such stress in people with such regularity. Mm-hmm. It seems very clear to me that this is something that's part of the design. So what you've got is incredible stress. You've got regression exercises. So people being asked to visualize being a child and visualize interactions with their mother or father.
Which I call hypnotic regression exercises.
Yeah. And these are often very traumatic for people as well, because you're asked to confront your parents about something bad that's happened. And, throughout those 3 days, people breaking down into tears was very kind of common. And people were incredibly stressed. So we've got the stress, and there's a number of different ways that they're generating it. Then we've got the sleep disruption, because you'll be finishing very late, and then there's homework that you've got to kind of do. And the homework tends to be quite stressful as well. It's really looking at things that you're doing wrong, things that are missing in your life, maybe contacting people that have had a bad influence on your life in some way, and, kind of repairing those relationships. But that can be incredibly traumatic to contact these people, although they'll justify it by saying, we want people to reconnect and we don't want their relationships to be broken. But my view is that it's just part of the recruiting tool, because every person that you reconnect with, they say, well, make sure you invite them to your graduation ceremony.
Right. They want you to recruit them. If I may just interrupt for one more second and share, when I was reading Edgar Schein's book, Coercive Persuasion, about Chinese communist brainwashing, and Margaret Singer studied it as well as Robert Lifton, he used Kurt Lewin's model of unfreezing, changing, and refreezing.
Yeah.
And what you're describing also fits that model of disorienting, overloading people, to confuse them, to bring up powerful emotional states in a very regulated environment. My memory is every chair has to be exactly in line. There's temperature control. They have monitors seated throughout the room to model, reactions, etc. So I just wanted to add a little more robustness.
Yeah, I mean,
to
and
your
I would add to that. I would point people towards my essay on LGATs and Fight Club as well, because the first thing that they really do when you get into the training is they get you to agree to a bunch of rules. So they say, these are the rules. You can't do this. This is how you speak. You can't speak to anyone next to you. You need to swap chairs. You can't sit next to the same person after a break. You can only have water in the environment. If you want to go to the bathroom, then you have to. And there are a number of ththings that you have to agree to before they allow you to carry on with the training.
And they want obedience.
That's often the case.
They want obedience.
So they set that up right at the beginning.
Right. So please continue.
So anyway, so for
great.
The first 3 days, we've got this incredible psychological stress, which, as I know, as somebody who's studied bipolar disorder, is a trigger. Then we've got the sleep disruption, which, as somebody who's studied bipolar disorder, I know is a trigger. So I'm worried about myself here. Then on the final day, so it's been 3 days of hell, really. And then on the final day, there's this very swift shift in mood from being highly oppressive and, you are, to use Robert J. Lifton's words, from non-people, you become people. And so they suddenly switch from you're the worst people ever, you're all assholes, and that's often the language that they would use. And then now suddenly you're amazing, you've graduated, you're one of us. The trainer steps down from the platform and kind of just becomes the same as everyone else. And everyone is now amazing, and there's hugging and all this sort of thing. So, and there's a graduation effectively on the final day. And then actually 2 days later as well, there's a more official graduation where they further celebrate it. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, okay, you've got stress, you've got sleep disruption, and you've got goal attainment. That's pretty amazing. Then I start looking at the way that people are responding to this training. And it was a combination of things. So we were promised certain things, both by the chairman of our company and by the trainer. You are going to experience this, right? And I'm observing what people are doing in terms of their behavior, in terms of what they're saying, etc. And then I later went to read about, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of what people were explaining they went through. And it aligned perfectly with hypomania. And hypomania's got a very specific fingerprint. It's not just feeling happy. So it's kind of a combination of things. So you see euphoria, you see like excessive confidence, impulsive behavior, sociability, increased energy, increased productivity, creativity. These are things that are being promised by these organizations when they can be framed as positive. So they might say to people, for example, you'll feel really good because that's something that's marketable. They may say to people, you'll be more decisive. They won't say you'll be impulsive. They'll say you'll be decisive. But if you actually look at the behavior of some people that are spending huge amounts of money immediately afterwards, quite recklessly, or getting divorced immediately afterwards, as a number of people at our organization did, that's incredibly impulsive. But they'll say you'll be more decisive. They'll say you'll be more confident. They'll say you'll be more productive. They won't speak about psychosis, which is a symptom of a real elevation. So that mania often is associated with psychosis. But those were some of the things that were reported over the last 50 years that these organizations have been around relatively consistently. There were articles published in the 70s and 80s, people experiencing psychosis, being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, brief psychotic episodes, and then depression as well. So some people were experiencing very low moods after participating, and there were even claims of suicides as a result of participation. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, all of the triggers for bipolar disorder are there. All of the symptoms, both on the upside and the downside, are there. There's something interesting kind of going on here. Maybe I can sort of make sense of it. So there were really two theories that kind of combined to help me understand this. So the first one was a psychoanalytic theory by a student of Freud's named Carl Abraham. So this was called the Manic Defense Hypothesis, and this was put forward in 1911. And if you know much about psychoanalysis, at the time they didn't really have a great understanding of the working of the brain. So it was a lot to do with energy and defense mechanisms and those kinds of things. But essentially what Carl Abraham said was that mania seems to be a defense that people have against feelings of inadequacy and guilt and shame and worthlessness and all that sort of thing. So when a person is being pushed down by these negative feelings, there's this unconscious force that kind of pushes back to keep the person in balance. Mm-hmm. And so it didn't involve dopamine or neurotransmitters because at the time they didn't have that level of understanding. But essentially what he was saying is that we want to stay in balance. We want to stay in homeostasis, and therefore we will generate these really positive thoughts to counteract the negative thoughts about ourselves. And sometimes those positive thoughts spiral out of control and kind of push you higher than what you should be. And that's what leads to mania. So that was the psychoanalytic component. Then I started looking at some of the theories, the more current theories that explain bipolar disorder. And one that's fairly common is something called the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder. And stated very simply, and there are neuroscientists who would be very upset with this simplification of this very complicated disorder. But basically the idea is that an elevation in dopamine, which is a brain chemical like serotonin or noradrenaline or GABA or, those sorts of things. When there's too much of this chemical, then we see mania or hypomania and mania. And when there's too little of this chemical, we see depression. And there's obviously a lot more going on, but it's just, there's a lot of evidence that dopamine's involved. And I can give you a little bit of detail if that might be useful.
Sure. Go for it.
So for example, if you give a normal person amphetamines, which elevates dopamine, then you'll start seeing symptoms that look very similar to hypomania and mania. The people that have got Parkinson's disease, we understand that Parkinson's disease has got to do with a breakdown of dopamine producing neurons in a particular pathway. And so they're given something called levodopa or L-dopa, which elevates dopamine and it allows them to move better and think better. And what a lot of people don't know about Parkinson's is actually that a lot of people with Parkinson's experience very low mood as well. They struggle with mood because the dopamine levels are quite low. What they would see is that some of these people that were taking L-dopa would start to experience hypomanic and sometimes even manic symptoms as well. So that was one of the indicators. There's a lot of brain imaging studies, so functional MRIs and PET scans and various other things that suggest that dopamine might be involved. And then you have these people who are quite unlucky who have Parkinson's disease and bipolar disorder. And so with Parkinson's, we know that it's because of a lack of dopamine. Sometimes when these people, and so say they're struggling with movements, which is a clear sign of Parkinson's disease, if they have a manic episode, there have been case studies of them, their movement improving while they're having the manic episode. So that's a pretty good indication that dopamine's got something to do with the manic episode because we know that it has an impact on movements. And there, again, a number of different indicators, but the idea is that dopamine plays a big role in hypomania and mania. So I saw this going on and I was like, okay, that's great. Let me see if there's any sort of relationship between what goes on in LGATs and dopamine. And so this is now literature that's quite separate and it's been built up over the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years. And I think that that's quite important to mention because in 1987, there was an article by Morton Lieberman, who was an early researcher of LGATs, and he basically said, there's no reason to assume, based on what we've seen so far, that these trainings couldn't cause psychological damage to some people. There's no reason for us to think that they couldn't cause damage. And there'd been a lot of reports of damage. So that's what his article was kind of referring to. But he said, but at the moment, we don't have a way of explaining the relationship between what goes on in the trainings and what we're seeing in terms of the claims of harm. And the claims of harm involved psychosis, mania, looking sort of symptoms, depression, that kind of thing.
Suicide.
So, suicides have been claimed as well. So that's just why I kind of say it's in the last 30 years that this research has emerged that's shown, for example, we know now that acute psychological stress causes an elevation in dopamine. Mm-hmm. So if you put an animal or a person through a high level of stress, dopamine elevates. Mm-hmm. Additionally, if you put a person through a lot of stress, or another way of saying that is if you put a person into a state of homeostatic imbalance, then the dopamine system becomes more sensitive to reward. So you stress a person, dopamine starts elevating, and the dopamine system is kind of going, if something rewarding happens, I'm going to really start firing properly. So what you've got and then we also know that rewarding events elevate dopamine. That's kind of the first thing that people knew about the dopamine pathway. It's often referred to as the reward pathway or the pleasure pathway. Something good happens, dopamine is elevated. So what you have in a large group awareness training is you've got a recipe for an elevation in dopamine, theoretically speaking. You've got stress elevating dopamine. You've got stress making the dopamine sensitive to something rewarding, and then you've got something incredibly rewarding happening immediately afterwards. So I was like, okay, well, great. That makes sense. So theoretically, it seems like these trainings could be elevating dopamine. And then when you look at the results of participation, they often refer to it as transformation or breakthroughs or whatever. But if you actually look at how participants, how their family members, how researchers in the past have described what's going on, they describe very specific things. And it's euphoria, confidence, energy, productivity, impulsivity, sociability, all of these things that are identical to hypomania, and in some cases identical to mania. Then you see at the very extreme kind of cases, you see psychosis, which is closely linked to an elevation in dopamine. So separate from the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder, there's the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia or the dopamine hypothesis of psychosis. And there, as I've said in my presentation, there are over 7,000 articles now on the relationship between dopamine and psychosis. Antipsychotic medications are often used to reduce dopamine signaling. So people that are likely to experience psychosis are given drugs that reduce dopamine because there's a lot of evidence that dopamine's involved. So that explains all of that stuff going on. And then you've got the relationship between extreme stress, or let's just say chronic stress, and dopamine. Mm-hmm. So if you stress a person out for too long, then it's kind of like sweating. You know, if you first go for a run, you sweat and it cools your body. But if you run for too long, eventually there's not going to be any sweat left. Similar thing with dopamine. When you initially put in that stressful situation, dopamine is produced. But if you keep a person in that state for too long, then you're going to deplete dopamine. And you know, there are going to be different people that go into these trainings. They're going to have different biological makeups. They're going to have different backgrounds. They're going to have experienced different things. So the way that this one-size-fits-all process impacts each individual is going to be different. So some people might just be overwhelmed by the process, whereas other people are, the dopamine still being produced and they feel amazing, and then maybe they just kind of come back down to normal, whereas other people might just be completely overwhelmed by the experience. So,
and I would just add, if I may, John, that you know, you mentioned people divorce, but some people fall in love with another participant, or they spend an outrageous amount of money on buying something they can't afford because of this manic, you know, state as well. But now they have consequences to these behaviors, right?
Well, often sometimes the divorce and the marriage are kind of closely related. So they fall in love with somebody at the course because they're in this state of feeling incredible around them. And then they divorce the person that isn't associated with it. And
because the person who's not associated with it doesn't want to join, and therefore they are undermining their progress or their spiritual development or some other crap.
I mean, there's often this argument made when you engage with people that are supporters of these organizations, that these organizations are all about bringing people together. They don't get you to break up with families and whatever, but you often see these problems in relationships as a result of participation. The relationships may get stronger for a while if both people join, or if the whole family does. But if you've got some people that are fanatics and some people that are just like, I don't want to get involved, often it can become an issue. But sorry, just to finish the thought in terms of the depression side of things. So there's a considerable amount of evidence that chronic stress leads to a depletion of dopamine, and there's also evidence that a depletion of dopamine is associated with depression. So while Morten Lieberman didn't have a way of explaining the relationship between what was going on in these seminars and the negative effects, the hypothesis that I've got, which is the Dopaminergic-Defense Hypothesis, explains both the positive effects and many of the claimed negative effects. And just to kind of, to close that loop in terms of why I call it the Dopaminergic-Defense Hypothesis, the idea is that if we're in a difficult situation, our brains have evolved to want to keep us in balance, to want to keep us in a homeostatic state. So we know the way that we respond to physical challenges. So if something threatening comes at us, the HPA axis kicks into gear. We start producing cortisol. We start producing adrenaline. Blood rushes to our muscles, all that sort of thing. We've spoken about sweating when we are getting too hot. Our body wants to kind of regulate us the whole time in terms of physical things. It makes sense that it would also want to regulate us in terms of psychological things. It doesn't like it when we are unhappy. It wants to make us feel okay. So what happens in these environments is you've got this very extreme situation where you're being made to feel guilt, shame, inadequacy, fear, all of these things at an incredible rate that you wouldn't normally experience. Additionally, your access to your normal defenses are being stripped away from you. So you can't really eat in the environment. Often it's 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours long that you've got to sit there. In terms of social support, they don't allow you to sit next to the same person after each break. So they don't allow you to kind of develop a support structure there. So there are a lot of things going on there. You've got a real sense of uncertainty, which is very stressful. You don't know what's going to happen next because they don't want to ruin the experience and nobody's told you. So it's this really extreme environment. And so because you don't have these other normal regulatory mechanisms at your disposal, my argument is that an endogenous chemical is being released, which helps you to feel like you can deal with the situation. And if we know anything about dopamine, we can look at things like cocaine and amphetamines and those sorts of things that people abuse. And the reason that they abuse them is because it feels really good to take them. You take these drugs and they make you feel like you can deal with anything. If you take cocaine, it's not inserting dopamine into your brain. The dopamine's already there. It's just making it more available. Same thing with amphetamines. So these chemicals are in our brains and they're sitting there, and they're used for various things. But our brains also don't operate in a way that kind of says, well, I'm going to use dopamine for this and that's what it's for. Our brains have evolved, so it's kind of like, okay, you're uncomfortable. If I release this thing, it's going to make you feel better. And so it makes sense that it would be released. So we've got evidence that it is released under those circumstances, but it also really makes sense that dopamine would be a really useful chemical to be released when you're made to feel like you can't deal with something, because it really makes you feel like you can. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, and I would add that we're talking about large group awareness trainings, but I can, say in my Mooney workshop, my first one, it was a parallel to this kind of pressure cooker of stress and, everything was controlled and limited access to information and all kinds of emotional manipulation as well.
Well, I actually used your book in my PhD at the end. So I used it to kind of say it's not just in these seminars that you see this pattern. So I looked at the fact that you went through a 3-day process of being made to feel quite guilty, stressed, sleep deprivation, and then elevated to an emotional high at the end. And I really think that the process is kind of it's used in all sorts of different places, even in some mainstream religions, to be completely honest.
Right. So can I shift and just say now we're living in a world of social media where things are engineered for dopamine bursts with likes or follows and such.
Yeah.
Can you apply a little bit to what I'm seeing? Because people are getting so addicted and they're going into these vortexes where they lose time and in many cases coming out with different beliefs. Being on platforms because of AI. You want to speculate on applying your model?
I'd have to look at those things individually to kind of understand, but I would think that there's more things going on. So what you see in a large group awareness training is, I often think of it as kind of a bad magician. So a person that's kind of, the moves are so obvious that you can really see what the process is. And it's very clear that it's very geared towards an elevation in dopamine, in my opinion. And that elevation in dopamine is not the same as you'd get from getting a couple of likes on something that you post social media. So it's a far more powerful thing. So that is going to play a much greater role in terms of influence in that environment. If you go onto, various sites, and I'm really just speculating here to a degree, but there's probably more of a sense of social identity that's coming with it as well. So you're feeling like you're part of a particular group. I would know that, for example, gambling is definitely geared towards elevating dopamine, because one of the other ways you elevate dopamine is with uncertainty.
Yeah.
So if you know that the reward is coming, there's not as much dopamine as if you don't know that it's coming. So
Right.
That's how kind of slot machines work. Is they kind of, the reinforcement is not every fifth pull; it's a number of pulls that you don't really know.
It's intermittent reinforcement is much more effective. Can I just also share, I listened to a podcast by a psychiatrist at Stanford who's an addiction expert. I believe she wrote a book called, yes, and Dopamine Nation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So that's actually fascinating. I actually contacted her and shared some of my research with her. I don't know if she's had a chance to read it. Mm-hmm. But what I found interesting is that her whole thing is really about that dopamine scale, like a balance.
Right.
And kind of saying that if we access dopamine too frequently and too often, then when we experience something rewarding, after a while, we're not going to find those things rewarding anymore. So it's really important that we get away from that easy access to enjoyment, which we find through the internet, through social media, and that kind of thing. But there was a chapter in her book which kind of spoke about things from the other perspective, which is obviously in line with, my research, although mine was before hers. And again, this is kind of the same as with Yuval. When you find somebody else who's got very similar ideas and they've come up with them they haven't seen your research, you haven't seen their research, right, but they come to similar things. And so there's a chapter on basically causing pain in order to lead to an elevation in mood. And so it's very much the same process of putting people through stress. And she speaks about people that are having ice baths and how there have been studies that show that dopamine is elevated massively after those ice baths because of the physical pain that people are put through. She speaks about some experiments that were done on animals, which are quite difficult, for me to read. But again, similar things, put them through something terrible, and then dopamine elevates afterwards. And when you read the descriptions of how these people are behaving afterwards, it's again hugely kind of confident and happy and full of energy and that sort of thing. So that same idea of the dopaminergic defense, you see coming through in that book. Yeah.
It's fascinating. I was also just thinking as you were talking, John, about B&D and S&M practices of, spanking and hitting and hurting and then feeling good about it. It's just...
Yeah, and I mean, even I would say the idea of like autoerotic asphyxiation is there's a parallel between that and what goes on in these seminars. It's a physiological reaction because you are getting your body to overcompensate for something. You're restricting something, and then it's overcompensating, and it feels really good afterwards. It's just happening on a far shorter term basis and with different goals in mind than these seminars. Yeah.
Right. So it's absolutely fascinating research, and I just see more neuroscience being developed to try to understand the relationship between thoughts and feelings and behaviors and environments.
Yeah.
And I guess for me at the moment, I'm most afraid of AI and bad actors deliberately dialing into people's reactions in order to cause them to, want to convert, have an ecstatic religious experience where they are willing to strap on a suicide vest and blow strangers up for some ideology or any number of
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the way that the groups that you've looked into, and I think certainly with large group awareness trainings, the way that they've developed their processes is through kind of trial and error. So they've found things that work and they keep those. They find things that don't work, they get rid of those, and that's how they evolve. What you're talking about now, I feel like there's just a far faster process. So that AI, or even just any form of the ability to take in a huge amount of information, tinker with things, find out what works, find out what doesn't work, is just means that the process is going to be accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily think that it will be AI in terms of some process that can necessarily work it out and think through it, but even just a process of kind of trial and error and working out like that. It doesn't have to be AI. I think can be really effective if you've got a lot of people's information and feedback online.
It's fascinating. So you're going to do a book based on your dissertation?
I would love to. Yeah, I need to kind of find some time from the work that I'm doing, but I'd really love to. I think there's a lot more to it as well. So there's the sort of neurobiology side, but then there's also quite a lot of social psychology and the psychological kind of components and how they relate. So it's one thing to say you're going to generate this powerful experience, but then how is that actually used as a tool of influence?
Right.
And what you see in large group awareness training is that they spend a lot of time convincing participants that they shouldn't trust their thinking. So they're thinking, they'll never be able to work out the process and that kind of thing. They should rather trust natural knowing, their experience, their hearts, that kind of thing. So they guide people towards being more trusting of an experience as form of evidence, and then they trigger this powerful experience at the end. And then they point to it and they say, you see, that's evidence of these things that we've been telling you. And I think that's I think that link as well is quite important to note.
Yeah, and I have a theory or an assumption that part of their deliberateness includes indoctrinating people into a belief system that there's no such thing as a victim, that you create your own reality, because then it leaves them off the hook for being...
Everyone's responsible for themselves, but they're not responsible for anyone. That's the amazing irony that seems to slip past. So you're responsible for, being molested as a 4-year-old, but we're not responsible for people that do something impulsive after our seminars. We gave you the technology, you used it how you wanted to use it. So there's quite a bit of hypocrisy going on.
A lot of, exactly, but it's quite, and I've been asked about LGATs, and I'm like, well, if they really are interested in transformation, why don't they hire mental health professionals and screen people before they go through this to identify people who may have bad reactions to it? Why don't they pay mental health professionals to be on site to be available to people? And the answer is because it costs too much money and because it would out what they're doing.
Yeah. And so, I know that some of the large organizations do have disclaimers that have been put together so they'll say, if you've got schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, depression, then don't take part. But to me, that's a pretty good indicator that they know that what they're doing is impacting some of the neurotransmitters that we've been speaking about. They certainly have paid psychologists in the past to do various things. I don't know if it's for the screening and that kind of thing, but I have my skepticism about some of the psychologists that have provided endorsements. To me, they just don't align with reality.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Unfortunately,
claims that the trainers are really sensitive and the environment is, very kind and gentle. And I'm reading thousands of people's descriptions of these things, and it just doesn't align with
Right.
what these mental health professionals were saying. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So, what's your future research? If somebody said we'll give you a grant, what do you want to do as future research, John?
Well, I mean, having chatted to you a little bit, I really like the idea of looking at the relationship between law and psychology and psychiatry, and kind of getting an understanding of what is required from a legal perspective for changes to be made. So it seems like we've got quite a lot of evidence. We've got a lot more evidence than they had in 1983, 1986, when the DIMPAC committee was putting things together. And I feel like there needs to be a revisiting of the information that we have, and a discussion with people from the legal profession to kind of say, what will it take for us to do X, Y, and Z? And then that can guide the research going forward. I feel like we've done a lot of the research.
Yeah.
And so rather than doing more research, it's kind of about figuring out, okay, how do we make this research as effective as possible?
So, I mean, for me, because I've been studying forensic psychology now for a bunch of years, because I want to update the law on this. And the thing about destructive mind control cults is they're doing impermissible social psychology experiments on people.
Yeah.
We can't do them and replicate them ethically because they're human subjects. So then how do we try to use scientific methods? My guess is there may be ways to use deep data. Maybe there are ways to study former attendees of these groups. But the other thing is it's I don't know, but I can tell you for sure, I look at social media and AI and how people are feeling more anxious, more depressed by being on platforms, and some people are committing suicide when their parents take their phones away from them because their whole identity is online instead of in the real world. And it just seems to me like there's going to be a lot of litigation against Facebook or Meta and so many of these other platforms, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, etc. But the question is, how can we do research that's scientifically validated? And then have experts go into courts of law and explain it in a way to judges and juries that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually chatting to my third year students today about the scientific process, and I was talking about hypothesis generation, and I kind of said to them, you often it starts with an observation. So in my case, for example, I observed what was going on in these seminars, and then through rationalism, you come up with some sort of theory to explain it, you generate a hypothesis, but then you want to test that hypothesis. So at the moment, I've got a hypothesis that there's an elevation in dopamine and it's causing these things, and a depletion of dopamine that's maybe causing depression. But in order for that to be verified, I'm going to have to take, 20 people, send them into an LGAT, measure their dopamine levels using functional MRIs or something like that, see if there's a change, which is a very expensive and difficult and practically challenging, as well as ethically problematic thing to do. I mean, the reason that I did my research using secondary data, using pre-existing books and journal articles and online discussions and that sort of thing, is because I didn't want to send anyone into one of these seminars.
Right.
I really believe that they are problematic. Even if you don't have a serious breakdown, I think that what is being done in the seminars is unethical. And I think that it's damaging, even if you come out, technically unscathed. So it is a real issue to test that hypothesis out. You can kind of replicate it in other spaces, but you can't put people through the level of stress that they go through in an LGAT. I think there's no research ethics committee that would sanction sending people into an LGAT if they knew exactly what goes on in them. So,
Right. They wouldn't.
It's an issue. And I mean,
Yep.
but that kind of tells you something as well. The fact that you can't do research on them is surely a red flag in itself.
Well, that's the double bind with social science research, because two of the most important social psychology experiments that I use in my work to explain undue influence is Milgram's obedience study and Zimbardo's prison study. It was those two, and there was one other third study that formed internal review boards, ethical standards for human subjects, because people were having serious breakdowns and bad reactions to it. And unfortunately, mind control cults are doing the impermissible social psychology experiments.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't have an answer to it, but I can tell you I was listening to a podcast by the Center for Humane Technology. They have a podcast called Your Undivided Attention, and they had a law professor and neuroscientist, Nita Farahani, I believe is her name. And she was talking about how the technology of headsets, virtual reality, and tracking. I'm wearing an Apple Watch. Oops. It's like collecting so much data, and they're going to get to a point where we have, you know, Bluetooth earbuds to listen, but it's going to be tracking our brain activity covertly. And yikes. Like, really? Do I really want to do that? Do I want to have the convenience of a Bluetooth, you know, earpiece, but have my brain activity scanned and recorded and put in the cloud for other people to potentially mine and figure out how to influence Steve Hassan? I don't know.
Stanley Milgram, one of his kind of comments, and I think Philip Zimbardo spoke about it as well, is that kind of that slippery slope. So we've already been moved in that direction, and you know, so we've kind of said, okay. So I think that's, you know. I think it was Zimbardo who said to get people to do evil things, you've got to do it gradually and quickly. So before they're thinking about it, but also in increments small enough that they don't notice how big the changes are. And I feel like we are already doing a lot of these things and providing a lot of people with information just because we want to be able to use their sites and X, Y, and Z. So yeah,
exactly.
Maybe
so Dr. John Hunter, fascinating work. Thrilled to know you, and I'm going to offer you any final thoughts to wrap up our interview.
Not too much more from my side. I'd love to make my research available to anyone who wants to have a look at it. I'm sure that you said you'd be making some of it.
Oh, absolutely. So we record this, and then we do a blog based on the interview. We embed the video of this interview, and we can add links, including links to your dissertation and your paper, and how to contact you.
That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Count on that.
And I mean, I enjoy interacting. Well, I mean, I enjoy it. I find it's fulfilling to interact with people that have been through large group awareness trainings and have kind of not really known how to explain their experience, you know, to themselves, but also to people around them. So I do think that my PhD research is very useful in that regard. A couple of articles that I've written, and that presentation from the ICSA conference as well. I think from the 1st of October it will be available, and I'm happy to share that with everyone as well.
It was great. I appreciate it. So be well, and I hope to meet you in person one day. Thank you so much.
That would be fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Steve. Cheers.
Great. Cheers. Steve Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.